1603. England stands at a crossroads. Queen Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudors, is dead. With no direct heir, the throne passes to an outside-era foreign king from Scotland. For the first time, England and Scotland are ruled by the same monarch. His name is James I of the Stuart dynasty, a man who believed he was chosen by God to rule, yet faced relentless opposition. A scholar and intellectual, but also deeply paranoid, his reign would see assassination plots, religious conflicts, and bitter political struggles. He survived the infamous Gunpowder Plot, but his belief in absolute monarchy would set the stage for a crisis that would one day tear England apart. Who was King James I? A visionary who united kingdoms, or a ruler who planted the seeds of a revolution? His story is one of ambition, conflict, and a legacy that shaped Britain forever. Before he became King of England, James had already lived a lifetime of power struggles, betrayal, and survival. His story did not begin in London, but in the rugged lands of Scotland, a kingdom plagued by instability and bloodshed. Born in 1567, James entered the world under a dark cloud. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was one of the most controversial rulers of her time. She was accused of conspiring to murder her husband, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned by her own people. When James was barely a year old, his mother was exiled to England, where she lived as a prisoner under Queen Elizabeth I before eventually being executed. This meant that James was crowned King of Scotland before he could even walk. But his throne was anything but secure. He was raised by regent's nobles who ruled in his name but fought for their own interests. Assassinations, uprisings, and betrayals shaped his early life. From the very beginning, James understood one thing: power was never safe. Despite the chaos, James was a brilliant student. He became one of the most well-educated kings in European history. He spoke multiple languages, studied philosophy, theology, and law, and believed deeply in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs ruled not by the will of the people, but by the will of God. For years, James ruled Scotland with an iron grip, navigating the treacherous world of Scottish clans, Protestant factions, and rebellious nobles. But everything changed in 1603, when Queen Elizabeth I of England died without an heir. After years of uncertainty over the English succession, James was the clear choice. He was Elizabeth's closest relative, and despite tensions between England and Scotland, he was invited to take the throne. James saw this as his greatest moment. For the first time, England and Scotland would be ruled by the same monarch. He left Edinburgh and traveled south to London, greeted by grand celebrations. But as he rode through his new kingdom, he failed to see the dangers ahead. England was not Scotland. It was a larger, wealthier, and more powerful kingdom, but it was also deeply divided. The people were wary of their new Scottish king. The nobles saw him as an outsider. Parliament, which had grown used to negotiating with Elizabeth, did not trust James's belief in absolute rule. Even the religious landscape was dangerous. England was Protestant, but many Catholics still lived in secret. Meanwhile, radical Puritans wanted even stricter religious laws. Both groups would soon turn against James. James may have been king, but his rule was not guaranteed. And soon, his throne would be threatened by one of the most infamous plots in history. James believed that ruling England would be easy, but within just 2 years, he would face a deadly conspiracy that would shake his reign to its core. James I entered England as a king who believed in absolute power, but he quickly realized that ruling England was not the same as ruling Scotland. The English Parliament had grown used to independence under Queen Elizabeth I, and they did not see James as a divine ruler. They saw him as a king who needed their approval. James, however, had no patience for negotiation. He firmly believed in the divine right of kings, that a monarch ruled not by the will of the people, but by the will of God. This belief would bring him into conflict with Parliament, with religious groups, and even with his own subjects. But before those tensions could fully erupt, James faced his first major crisis, the Gunpowder Plot. England was officially a Protestant country, but Catholics had long lived in fear. Under Queen Elizabeth I, Catholic priests had been hunted, arrested, and even executed. Many believed that James, as the son of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, might be more sympathetic to their cause. But when he arrived in England, they quickly learned otherwise. James increased restrictions on Catholics, forcing them to attend Protestant services or face heavy fines. Catholics who had hoped for tolerance felt betrayed, and some decided that James had to die. This led to one of the most infamous assassination attempts in history. Gunpowder Plot of 1605. A group of Catholic conspirators, led by Robert Catesby, devised a plan to blow up the Houses of Parliament on the opening day of session. The explosion would kill James, his government, and many Protestant nobles, throwing England into chaos and allowing Catholics to take control. The plot was meticulously planned. Barrels of gunpowder were smuggled into a cellar beneath Parliament. The fuse was set, and one man was left to light the spark, Guy Fawkes. But the plan never succeeded. Just days before the attack, an anonymous letter warned a nobleman to stay away from Parliament. The letter reached the authorities, and in the early hours of the 5th of November, 1605, soldiers stormed the cellar beneath Parliament. There, they found Guy Fawkes standing guard over the gunpowder. He was arrested immediately. Under days of brutal torture, Fawkes revealed the names of his fellow conspirators. One by one, they were captured or killed in shootouts with royal forces. Those who survived faced a public execution so brutal that it sent a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the king. James had survived. The monarchy had been saved. But the Gunpowder Plot only made him more paranoid. From that moment on, he cracked down harder on Catholics, enforcing even stricter laws against them. He also became more convinced that any challenge to his rule was an attack against God himself. This belief would shape the rest of his reign and would bring him into direct conflict with Parliament. James had survived an assassination attempt, but his next battle would not be fought with gunpowder. It would be a battle of power, one that would define his entire reign. After the Gunpowder Plot, James I tightened his grip on England. He had proven that he could survive an assassination attempt, but now he had to face an even greater challenge: controlling Parliament. James saw himself as an absolute ruler, chosen by God to govern without interference. But in England, Parliament was growing more powerful, and its members saw themselves as representatives of the people. Unlike in Scotland, where James had ruled with near total control, in England, he was expected to negotiate, compromise, and govern alongside Parliament. James, however, had no interest in compromise. From the moment he took the throne, he clashed with Parliament over money, taxation, and royal power. James spent lavishly on his court, rewarding his favorites with wealth and titles. But England was not as rich as it had been under Queen Elizabeth I. The wars with Spain had drained the treasury, and James's extravagant spending pushed England deeper into debt. To fix this, he demanded more money from Parliament. But Parliament refused. They saw James's spending as wasteful and irresponsible. They wanted him to cut expenses and rule with financial discipline. James saw this as an insult to his authority. Each time Parliament refused his requests, James dissolved it, ruling without them whenever possible. He found other ways to raise money, selling royal lands and creating new taxes without Parliament's approval. But these tactics only made Parliament angrier. Tensions between the monarchy and Parliament kept growing. James insisted that kings had absolute power, while Parliament pushed back, insisting that England was not a dictatorship. James's biggest mistake, however, was in his choice of advisors. He surrounded himself with favorites, young men who he showered with wealth, power, and influence. One of the most notorious was George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. James promoted Buckingham to the highest ranks of government, ignoring Parliament's warnings about his inexperience and corruption. Parliament hated Buckingham, and they began to question James's judgment. Meanwhile, another problem was brewing religion. James had already cracked down on Catholics after the Gunpowder Plot, but now he faced growing unrest from another group, the Puritans. The Puritans were extreme Protestants who wanted to purify the Church of England of any remaining Catholic traditions. They wanted harsher laws against Catholics, simpler church services, and more religious freedom for Protestants. James refused to give in to their demands. He saw their ideas as dangerous, a challenge to his rule. The Puritans, frustrated and disillusioned, began leaving England, sailing across the Atlantic to start a new life in America. This group would later become known as the Pilgrims, and their journey to the New World would mark the beginning of English colonization in North America. James's refusal to compromise on religion, money, and power left England more divided than ever. And while he managed to hold his kingdom together, he was setting the stage for a future crisis zone that would explode after his death. James had fought to keep control, but his decisions were creating enemies everywhere. His belief in absolute rule would not only define his reign, it would shape the future of England in ways he could never have imagined. By the early 1620s, King James I was losing his grip on power. His court was filled with corruption, his wars were draining England's economy, and his conflicts with Parliament were becoming impossible to ignore. He had ruled England for nearly 2 decades, yet he had failed to achieve the thing he wanted most: absolute authority. The cracks in his reign were becoming visible to everyone. One of the biggest points of tension was his foreign policy. James wanted peace with Spain, England's old enemy. But the English people, especially Parliament, hated Spain. They saw Catholic Spain as a threat to Protestant England, and many nobles wanted war to weaken Spanish influence in Europe. James, however, had other plans. In 1623, he made a controversial decision, tried to arrange a marriage between his son, Prince Charles, and a Spanish princess. This was a disaster. Parliament was furious. They saw the match as an attempt to bring England closer to Catholic Spain, a betrayal of their Protestant identity. Anti-Spanish riots broke out in London. Even worse, the Spanish humiliated Prince Charles during his visit to Spain, refusing to agree to the marriage unless England converted to Catholicism. The negotiations collapsed, and Charles returned to England angry and humiliated. When Parliament demanded war with Spain, James had no choice but to give in, but he had no money to fight. Once again, he was forced to go back to Parliament, begging for funds. Parliament agreed to provide money, but in return, they wanted something in exchange. They demanded the removal of James's closest advisor, the Duke of Buckingham. This was an impossible demand. James loved Buckingham, treating him almost like a son. He refused to remove him even as Parliament turned against him completely. The divide between king and Parliament was now deeper than ever. With his power slipping, James became increasingly paranoid and withdrawn. He spent his last years in illness and isolation, trusting no one except Buckingham and a few loyal advisors. The man who had once crossed Scotland and England as a triumphant king was now struggling just to hold on to control. James had spent his entire life fighting to keep power, but in the end, power was slipping through his fingers. And as he reached his final days, the future of England was already moving beyond his control. By the early 1620s, King James I was no longer the strong, confident ruler he had once been. His health was failing, his authority was being challenged from all sides, and his once unshakable belief in absolute monarchy was beginning to crumble. He had spent his reign trying to keep control over Parliament, over religion, over his own court, but as the years passed, it became clear that England was slipping out of his hands. One of the greatest blows to his power came not from war, not from Parliament, but from within his own family. His son, Prince Charles, had once been a quiet, obedient heir, watching as his father battled with Parliament and ruled with an iron hand. But as James weakened, Charles began to step forward, preparing for his own rule. And Charles had learned all the wrong lessons. Instead of learning from his father's mistakes, his constant battles with Parliament, his failure to balance power, Charles saw only one thing: a king must never be questioned. While James had at least tried to work with Parliament at times, Charles believed there was no need for negotiation. He saw Parliament as an enemy, an obstacle that needed to be removed completely. James, sensing the growing tensions in his kingdom, tried to secure his son's future before it was too late. He insisted on Charles's marriage to a French Catholic princess, hoping it would strengthen ties between England and France. Parliament saw this as yet another betrayal, another sign that the Stuart kings were leaning too close to Catholicism in a Protestant country. The nobles and Puritans who had tolerated James would not tolerate Charles. James's final years were filled with isolation and paranoia. He had once ruled 2 kingdoms with confidence, but now he saw enemies everywhere. He distrusted Parliament. He distrusted many of his own nobles. He even began to question the loyalty of his closest advisor, the Duke of Buckingham. But he would never get the chance to fight back. In early 1625, James fell seriously ill. Some believed it was fever. Others suspected a stroke. His body had weakened after years of stress, and by March of that year, his condition worsened. As he lay on his deathbed, surrounded by his closest courtiers, he must have wondered what would come next. Would Charles be strong enough to rule? Would Parliament ever be controlled? Would his vision of an all-powerful monarchy survive? He would never know the answer. On the 27th of March, 1625, King James I took his final breath. He had ruled Scotland for 57 years and England for 22 years. His reign was over, but his legacy's failures, his conflicts, his belief in royal power would live on. Because the son who took his place would not just face opposition, he would face a revolution. James I had fought to keep the monarchy strong, but his son, Charles I, would take his father's vision of absolute power even further too far. And soon, England would descend into civil war. On the 27th of March, 1625, the first Stuart king of England was dead. James I, the man who had ruled 2 kingdoms, survived assassination attempts, fought endless battles with Parliament, and tried to unite England and Scotland, was gone. He had spent his entire life fighting for absolute monarchy, believing that kings ruled by the will of God and were above the laws of men. He had tried to hold his power together through diplomacy, through force, and through sheer will. But as his body lay still, the kingdom he left behind was far from stable. James had never been fully accepted by the English nobility. To them, he was always an outside-era Scottish king ruling an English throne. They tolerated him, but they never loved him the way they had loved Queen Elizabeth I. He had spent years trying to secure his rule, but he never earned the loyalty of Parliament, the Puritans, or even the common people. And the worst part? Everything he fought for was about to be destroyed. James had believed that his son, Charles I, would continue his legacy. He had raised Charles to rule with the same belief in absolute monarchy that a king should never be questioned, never be challenged. But what James failed to see was that his son would take those beliefs even further. While James had fought with Parliament, he had at least tried to maintain a balance. He had dissolved it, ignored it, and argued with it, but he had also called it back when he needed money or political support. Charles, however, would have no patience for Parliament at all. Where James had negotiated, Charles would refuse to bend. Where James had relied on advisors, Charles would rule with his own absolute decisions. Where James had seen power as something to be held onto carefully, Charles saw it as something to be demanded. And this would lead England to a disaster that James had never foreseen. Because while James had spent his life trying to hold on to power, his son would push too hard. He would challenge Parliament directly, refuse to listen to his nobles, and demand absolute loyalty from a kingdom that was already beginning to resist the monarchy. This would not just lead to political unrest, it would lead to war. James had spent his life defending the monarchy, but his son would take his father's beliefs to the extreme and it would cost him his head. The Stuart dynasty was about to face its greatest challenge yet. James I had fought to secure the throne, to establish himself as an undisputed monarch, and to defend the divine right of kings. He believed he had succeeded. But the kingdom he left behind was far weaker than he realized. His death in 1625 marked the end of an era, but the beginning of a much greater conflict tone that would not only test the power of the monarchy, but also change England forever. James's reign had been filled with conflict, but it had not yet led to full rebellion. He had survived Parliament's resistance, fought through economic struggles, and even escaped the Gunpowder Plot. He had ruled with paranoia, balancing between cooperation and hostility with England's ruling class. But the real battle was only beginning. His son, Charles I, had inherited all of James's beliefs, but none of his caution. Charles believed, even more strongly than his father, that a king must never be questioned. He did not see Parliament as an institution to work with, but as an enemy to be removed. And so, Charles I would take the path that James had feared, but never walked. Within just a few years of taking the throne, Charles dissolved Parliament completely and ruled England without it for over a decade. He imposed heavy taxes, ignored the grievances of his people, and forced religious changes upon Scotland, igniting a war that would spill into England itself. The seeds of civil war had been planted under James, but they would grow into a full-blown revolution under Charles. By 1642, just 17 years after James's death, England was at war with itself. King against Parliament. The monarchy versus the people. And this war would not end with a compromise. It would end with the unthinkable, the execution of a king. James had fought to defend the monarchy, but his son, Charles I, would take that fight too far. And for the first time in history, England would put its own king on trial. The Stuart dynasty was heading toward its darkest hour. King James I had fought for his throne, for his vision of absolute monarchy, and for his belief that kings ruled by divine right. He had survived assassination plots, religious conflict, and political battles. But in the end, his greatest legacy was not in what he achieved, but in what came after him. He had united the crowns of England and Scotland, but he had failed to unite their people. He had defended the power of kings, but in doing so, he had planted the seeds of rebellion. And those seeds would grow into a revolution. His son, Charles I, would take his father's dream of absolute monarchy to the extreme, refusing to bend, refusing to compromise. And in the end, that decision would cost him everything. Just a generation after James's death, the Stuart dynasty would face a fate no English royal family had ever faced before. So how should history remember James I? Was he a wise king who tried to unite two nations? Or was he a ruler who failed to understand the changes happening around him? Did he lay the foundation for the British monarchy as we know it today? Or did he plant the seeds of its greatest crisis? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story fascinating, wait until you hear about his son, Charles III, king, who would push England into civil war and lose his head on the executioner's block.